WIZZFX.
Welcome. Okay, episode 9, part 3 of Sonic Identity. Let's roll the intro. Okay, so if you haven't seen the first 2 parts in this, definitely go back and watch them. Episode 7 of Before the Door is part 1 of Sonic Identity. Episode 8, part 2, and now we're in episode 9 of Before the Door, part 3 of Sonic Identity. So in this final part, we're going to talk about these 3 things. 1, don't give listeners a reason. Even your client messaging should sound like imaging. 2, how to make production to complement your station momentum. And 3, is loud really necessary anymore? So the first one I want to talk about is not giving the listeners a reason. And by that I mean making sure your client messaging feels cool and embedded in your brand. I mean, there are 2 points here really. 1, a client's buying integration with your brand. So you want it to fit in nicely. And sometimes that means you've got to get a bit stricter on what you allow a client to say, if you can. And other times that means not just tacking it on the end of a cool piece of production, because you spend all this time building this cool piece of production and then you just tack a tagline on the end. It just kind of strips all the energy and excitement out of the piece of production, right? So it's not going to help, and it doesn't aid the listener journey, and it doesn't benefit the listener to do that. So it's kind of that. So, and then this other point is, by making it sound good, it just fits better and keeps that, as I say, the excitement and the energy up. So really thinking about how you can do that is important. And it could be, there are lots of different ways you could do it. But if you've got client taglines that you could work into scripts in a clever way, do it. Don't just tack it on the end, write it into the copy and make it interesting or make it part of the creative treatment. The client's going to love that. The client isn't necessarily going to love just being tacked on the end of the promo or the piece of imaging. The other way you could approach it is to have a suite of music pieces that fit with your brand, and some vocal samples or some drops or something that kind of fits with what you're doing on your station, and then have the sponsors or the client messaging sort of fit around that so it feels like a cool sweeper, even though it's getting away a client message. Listeners are super discerning now, right? They understand that something's going to be sold. They understand the need for advertising. But if they can tell that it's advertising, you're more likely to lose them. So by embedding the client messaging more into your brand, you can have much more success. And actually, as I sort of alluded to before, we made a bunch of music and a vocal sample stuff for Hits Radio here in the UK so that they could do this with their sponsorship credits, their client messaging. By embedding it, making it feel a little bit closer to their station sound, it becomes much more exciting. And I've used this word authentic a lot, but it does just bring some sort of level of authenticity to the brand, because they're treating their client stuff the same way they treat their imaging. So the excitement and the energy and the pace is there, and the momentum is there, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. And that's going to benefit the listener, but the client's going to love it because they're getting into the brand. They sound like your brand, and that's what they want. That's why they're having a partnership with you. I mean, I don't know how many different ways I can say exactly the same thing, but you get my point. It's really, really imperative to think about it more than just to tack on the end. So the next point is how to make production sort of aid your station momentum and flow. And we briefly just touched on momentum, but actually back in episode 4, we talked a lot about station momentum. So I just want to dream sequence back to what I was talking about then. If you're going to have a promo at the top of your ad break, for example, do you need to have an inter-break ID? Are you going to have the promo at the end of the break? Do you need to have an outer-break ID? Whereabouts is the station name going to fall in both of those things in order to not just be repetitive and say it too many times in a row? These are the things that you can start to think about when implementing your imaging, so that you get really nice flow and consistency of message, and you're not becoming shouty because your interbreak says the station name, then the first word in the promo says the station name. You might decide to have a sort of loose rule that is, if the interbreak says the station name, which I'm guessing it would, then a promo first in break might not mention the station name till at least halfway through, or only at the end, just as a rough example. And obviously the opposite might occur at the end of the break, where the promo, you might like to start with the station name, and you might like to end the promo without the station name because it's going into an out of break ID, and that's going to end with the station name. Or you might like to do away with the out of break to ID altogether and just have the promo at the end. You see, you can start to think about these things and really try to measure the slickness that you're going to create in order to have the best possible listening experience for your listener. Welcome back from the dream. So now you can start to think about how you'll create all of the stuff, how you'll apply all of that knowledge. Are you going to have certain elements that kind of ramp up and to handshake best with pieces of production? Are they going to have tail outs? How are they actually going to fit together? Now's the time to think about that before you start producing them. And the last thing to talk about in this mini-series within a series about sonic identity within Before the DAW is talking about whether loud is really necessary anymore. Do we need to slam the crap out of the production that we're making? And I mean, listen, there's a loudness war thing that has been bubbling away on and off, and things get louder, things get quieter over time. But actually, some of our biggest competitors in radio space, so podcasts, streaming platforms, they all now adopt LUFS, which is an average measurement of loudness over time. They all have a kind of gold standard for how loud things should appear in the LUFS scale. LUFS, yeah. And that's dangerous for radio because radio doesn't employ that. It just slams the crap out of everything. And I think it's going to start to tire listeners out. They're starting to realize that there is more dynamic range in these other platforms and podcasts and streaming. And I think it might be time for radio to have a little bit of a serious look at whether it's important to adopt some sort of measurement, some sort of consistency, and bring dynamic range back into the piece. But what you can do for now is forget about slamming things. They can be loud, don't get me wrong, but try to work with LUFS in mind. We at WIZZFX use LUFS as a great consistency measurement between multiple producers. Everything we make has the same level, sounds the same in terms of loudness, but also across projects. So when we make something for lots of different stations, all of those stations have the same kind of loudness feeling to it. I mean, it's all going to run through their optimods and be sucked up next to the music they're playing anyway, but just by adopting that consistency for the work that we're doing, we're starting to want to play in that world of LUFS and respecting listeners' ears and the need for dynamic range. So maybe think about it. It can be a great way to ensure consistency in your own work, as I've mentioned, but also you're starting to really think about what the listeners want, and that's ultimately what we want to do when we're building ratings. And that's what we can do as radio imaging producers, is make these decisions and take these approaches based on the fact that these people, these are our listeners, want dynamic range back, and they're starting to go for platforms that have it. So let's start thinking about it. Okay, so that was a bit of a rant there at the end, but I think you get my picture. That's it for this 3-part on sonic identity. We've got one more episode in Before the DAW to come, and we're going to be talking about taking time, something none of us ever have. Until then, if you've got any thoughts, questions, comments, or feedback, you can get in touch, info@wizzfx.com. You can find us on lots of the socials, or you can head over to the website, wizzfx.com, and use the contact form there. We'll see you in the final episode. Cheers.
Custom imaging, sound design, music, WIZZFX.